Isabella, we're letting you go. I froze. The words bounced around my skull like a drum, loud and relentless. My mouth opened, closed, opened again. 5 years of sweat, sleepless nights, ideas stolen and passed off as his brilliance, promotions sidestepped, every ounce of my dedication reduced to 3 simple words. I felt the boardroom tilt slightly, though the room itself hadn't moved. Time slowed, like someone had pressed pause on reality just for me. I could hear my heartbeat in the silence. 1 thump, 2 thumps, louder than Mr. Whitmore's smug voice, louder than the faint hum of the air conditioner trying to keep the office comfortable. He sat there, a man who believed he was untouchable. His hair slicked back, cufflinks gleaming, tie perfectly knotted, a man sculpted to perfection by his own arrogance. He was the kind of boss who thought compliments were currency and cruelty was just tough love. "Take a seat," he said, voice smooth, syrupy, rehearsed. As if he were inviting me to tea, not sentencing me to professional oblivion. I lowered myself into the chair, the leather squeaking under my weight. Around me, the colleagues shifted, the quiet ones, the gossipy ones, the ones who smiled too brightly when others fell. Their faces were a gallery of amusement disguised as sympathy. "I'm afraid we've reached a difficult decision," he continued, twirling his pen. "We're letting you go." The words finally registered fully, and something cold and sharp coiled in my stomach. I wanted to scream, to throw the chair, to rip the pen from his hand and snap it in half. But I didn't. I had been trained, drilled, conditioned to smile politely, nod, and endure. Okay. I managed to say, my voice steadier than my insides felt. He leaned back, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, smug and triumphant. "I know it's sudden, Isabella, but sometimes tough decisions must be made." Oh, the performance. Every syllable dripping with self-satisfaction, every gesture a reminder that he believed he owned the world, and everyone in it. A colleague, the one with the too perfect hair and a laugh like gravel, chuckled. The sound was sharp, abrasive, and utterly unnecessary. I felt my jaw tighten. This is the comedy of cruelty, I thought. They've been rehearsing this act without me knowing it. I rose from my chair, deliberately slow, my hands curling around the strap of my bag like it was a lifeline. They expected tears. They expected begging. They expected silence. I gave them none of that. The hallway stretched before me like a corridor of judgment. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, mocking my humiliation, while the polished floor reflected every step I took. My heels clicked, 1, 2, 3, a metronome to my fury. I could feel their eyes, invisible fingers tracing my back, weighing, calculating, savoring the spectacle of my downfall. When I reached the elevator, I leaned against the cold metal wall and let myself breathe. The city outside was oblivious, indifferent, just like everyone else in that room. Cars honked, people shouted at crossing lights, pigeons fought over scraps on the pavement. Life went on, except mine had just been rewritten. My phone buzzed. One message. "They don't know who you really are." I stared at the screen. My pulse quickened, fear mixing with something else, a dangerous thrill, like electricity dancing under my skin. Betrayal tastes metallic in your mouth, but beneath it was clarity. A spark. A promise. I remembered the envelope tucked away in my apartment. The one I'd ignored for months. A forgotten document hinting that my life wasn't exactly what it seemed. That maybe the power I thought was stolen from me wasn't gone at all. It had just been waiting, quietly, like a coiled spring. I let myself smile. Not because I was happy. Not yet. But because I knew the story was far from over. Every stolen idea, every insult, every snide remark, every step of my humiliation would one day be repaid. Not with rage. Not with petty revenge. With precision. With power. And they would realize, too late, that Isabella Hart was never the employee they thought they knew. The elevator doors closed, the city blurred past, and I felt the storm begin to gather inside me. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. If you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or told you're not enough, you know exactly how I feel right now. This is just the beginning of my story, and I promise, it only gets more intense from here. I want to hear from you. A comment below. Have you ever had someone try to hold you back, only for you to prove them wrong? Your story matters. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single moment of this journey. Trust me, you'll want to see how far I go and how they react when they finally realize who I really am. I slumped into the driver's seat of my car, letting the door close with a soft click that sounded far too final. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Cars honking, streetlights blinking, neon signs flickering. But none of it reached me. Everything felt muted, unreal, as if the world had been dimmed, leaving only the enormity of my own thoughts to fill the space. They're gone.
I'm fired.
Humiliated. A joke. The words replayed in my head like a broken record. And yet, beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, a tiny ember of something unfamiliar flickered. Clarity. For years, I had been a ghost in my own story. Every late night, every presentation, every stolen idea, it all built something no one but me had ever seen. And now, stripped of title, stripped of recognition, I could see it all laid bare. The people I trusted, the colleagues I thought were allies, even Mr. Whitmore, all of them believed they had won. They were wrong. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, leather envelope I'd almost forgotten. It had been sitting there for months, gathering dust and neglect, a family document, dismissed at the time as bureaucratic nonsense. But now, in this moment of humiliation, it demanded attention. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside, faded ink traced words that felt like a lifeline thrown across time. Isabella, if you're reading this, the company we built together is yours. Not because of a title or a contract, but because it belongs to you. Protect it. Claim it when the time is right. Trust yourself. I blinked. The words sank slowly, like water seeping into a parched throat. My grandfather had left me more than memories. He had left me power. Real, undeniable, terrifying power. And the people who had just humiliated me had no idea. I pressed my palms to the steering wheel and let the reality wash over me. Every insult, every stolen idea, every whispered joke behind my back, it had all been a rehearsal for this moment. They didn't see me. They never had. But now, they were about to learn the truth. I pulled out my phone, tapping through contacts, emails, and notes. Every project I had saved for them, every flaw in Mr. Whitmore's brilliance, it was all fuel. I began making lists, sketching strategies, imagining the moves I would make when the time came. Every late night spent fixing disasters he'd created suddenly felt like preparation, not punishment. The car's interior felt like a cocoon. The hum of the engine, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the cup holder, the city's noise outside, all of it faded into the background as a single thought crystallized. I had to disappear before I could strike.
Linkage?
Deleted. Email traces?
Gone.
Digital footprints? Erased. If they looked for me, they would find nothing. I leaned back, letting the leather seat mold to my shape, and closed my eyes. I allowed myself a single, quiet smile. Not because I was happy, not yet, but because I understood something that no one else did. The game had changed. And then came the planning. The small, meticulous plotting of every step. Each contact, each former colleague, each weak point in Mr. Whitmore's armor became a potential lever. And every move had to be perfect, subtle, undeniable, surgical. One misstep, and it could all collapse. But done right, and the empire that had dismissed me would bend to my will. I thought of the envelope again, of my grandfather's words. The company was mine, not because they'd given it to me, not because I had earned it in their eyes, but because it had always been mine. And now, stripped of titles and status, stripped of pretense, I could finally claim it. I drove through the city streets, each turn a meditation, each stoplight a chance to reflect. With every passing block, my fury transformed into something sharper, cleaner, a strategy. I was no longer just Isabella Hart, the employee. I was Isabella Hart, the storm quietly rising, the force they would never anticipate. And then I paused at a red light, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I saw someone unafraid, someone untouchable, someone who understood the scope of her own power. I swallowed hard. The journey had begun.
The storm was gathering.
And they had no idea it was coming. The first rule of reclaiming power is becoming someone unrecognizable. Not in appearance alone, but in presence, in perception. I was still Isabella Hart, but the world would no longer recognize her. Not the submissive, overworked employee. Not the invisible cog in Mr. Whitmore's machine. I spent days in preparation. Weeks, really. Waking early, running through every memory, every interaction, every slight I'd endured. Each one became a lesson. Every mistake I'd made, every moment I had hesitated, was a step in the plan now forming in my mind. I stood before the mirror that morning and studied my reflection like a strategist surveying a battlefield. Sharp cheekbones, calm eyes, a jaw set in unyielding determination. I practiced the subtle tilt of my head, the lift of a brow, the kind of smile that suggested competence and power without arrogance, a smile that could disarm or intimidate, depending on what the moment demanded. Clothes were more than fabric. They were armor. My blazer was tailored to perfection, sharp lines cutting through the softness of the world around me. Heels clicked like measured beats of a drum as I walked. Hair sleek, posture unshakable. Every detail screamed precision, control, and authority. I left my apartment and entered the city, like a new force moving through familiar streets. The world around me hadn't changed, but I had. The coffee shop barista didn't recognize the new energy in my steps. The taxi driver's casual glance held nothing. I was invisible, yet unmistakable. Invisible to the ordinary eye, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. The first move had to be subtle. I wasn't ready for confrontation, not yet. My plan demanded finesse. So, I started small, an anonymous proposal sent directly to the company board. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even my full potential. But it solved a problem no one else had managed to fix. A project that had been languishing under Mr. Whitmore's direction now looked achievable, promising, even brilliant. I watched the reactions quietly, from a distance. Colleagues whispered. Some speculated, some gossiped, some admired the mysterious consultant who had solved the unsolvable. And Mr. Whitmore? He strutted around, oblivious, boasting about smooth management and team cohesion, entirely blind to the fact that the ground beneath him was shifting. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. The slight hesitation in his steps, the small twitch in his smile, the momentary pause before he responded to emails, subtle cracks forming in the armor of his confidence. And I smiled. Slowly, patiently. Every small victory, every unnoticed success, was a thread I could pull to unravel the facade he had built around himself. I began to sketch, to plot, to anticipate every move he might make. Every colleague I had once dismissed as harmless now became a piece on the chessboard. Every weakness, every blind spot, every arrogance I had catalogued over the years was fuel for the plan taking shape. The thrill of it was intoxicating. I wasn't just surviving. I was orchestrating. Invisible strings pulling at a puppet who thought he was untouchable. And the best part? He had no idea. Not yet. I paused one evening, looking out over the city from my small apartment. The lights stretched endlessly, millions of lives continuing in their oblivion. And yet, I felt like a storm contained in a glass bottle, ready to break free at the right moment. My grandfather's words returned to me, almost a whisper in my mind. Claim it when the time is right. Trust yourself. I trusted myself. More than I ever had. More than anyone ever thought I could. The past humiliation, the firing, the mockery, all of it had been preparation. Not for revenge, not for petty satisfaction, but for precision, for control, for power reclaimed. And now, with every plan drafted, every strategy considered, every step calculated, the world could only wait. Wait for the storm. Wait for Isabella Hart, No longer the employee they thought they knew, but something far more formidable. And when they finally realized it, it would be too late. I watched the city from my apartment window, lights blinking in the evening haze like tiny stars oblivious to the storms below. And yet, I knew a storm was coming. A storm I had carefully, deliberately set into motion. The anonymous proposal had landed on the board's desks the night before. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It was elegant, precise, and indisputably brilliant. A solution to a problem no one in the company had been able to solve. And now, whispers began circulating, subtle at first. Who sent this? Some outside consultant? It's genius, but how did they figure it out? And Mr. Whitmore, he walked into the office that morning like a man, unaware the floor beneath him was cracking. His confidence seemed intact, his posture perfect, his smile still the polished mask he wore so well. But it only took a moment. A slight pause before he spoke, a hesitation in his steps, the twitch at the corner of his eye, for the first cracks to appear. He tried to claim the work as his own. Oh, the arrogance. Team effort, he said, nodding as if everyone would believe him. And some did. Some always will. But others exchanged glances, the quiet ones, the observant ones. And I smiled quietly to myself, hidden miles away. Every glance, every pause, every whispered speculation, all evidence of the tide turning, even if he refused to notice it yet. Over the next few days, I moved like a shadow. Subtle emails, minor anonymous suggestions, invisible corrections to ongoing projects. Nothing so blatant as to draw suspicion, but enough to create friction where none had existed. Systems started running smoother, deadlines met faster, results improving. Yet no one could point to why. They only sensed it, a presence, a force quietly reshaping the company from behind the scenes. I began keeping meticulous notes. Every misstep of Whitmore's became a lesson, a potential lever. How he dismissed ideas without hearing them. How he underestimated colleagues who quietly outperformed him. How he nervously adjusted his tie when a question he hadn't anticipated came up. Every detail catalogued. Every weakness stored for the moment when precision, not anger, would deliver justice. Then came the first test. A high-profile presentation scheduled to impress the board, one he had been preparing for weeks. The kind of event designed to cement his leadership in their eyes. I made a small adjustment. Tiny. Almost invisible. But it was enough to force a hesitation. Data slightly misaligned.
Charts subtly altered.
Nothing obvious, nothing traceable. Just enough to disrupt his rhythm. I watched the live stream feed from a cafe across town. Legal, unobtrusive, under the guise of casual work. My coffee cooling beside me as the boardroom unfolded. Whitmore started confidently. His voice polished. His posture perfect. But then pause. A micro-frown. A subtle stumble over the data he thought he had memorized. Board members exchanged looks. Whispers floated across the room. Confidence wavered. And I felt it, a thrill so sharp it cut through the memory of humiliation I had carried for weeks. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The effect spoke for itself. Every small disruption, every shift in attention, every fraction of doubt sowed in his mind, all of it was my invisible hand at work. Over the following days, the ripple spread. Minor projects I had left suggestions for began yielding results. Colleagues started asking questions, subtly testing ideas. And Whitmore. He grew paranoid. His meetings lengthened unnecessarily. He repeated himself, over-explained, overcompensated. The cracks widened ever so slightly but visibly. I would walk past the building in the evenings, watch the lights glow in the boardroom as he paced like a man trying to solve a problem he couldn't understand. And I remained patient, invisible, untouchable. Subtlety was my weapon.
Precision my ally.
The most beautiful part of it all? He still had no idea who I was. That the ghost manipulating his every move, the unseen hand correcting, guiding, revealing his flaws, was the same Isabella Hart he had fired, mocked, dismissed. I began mapping the next steps in my journal. Colleagues whose loyalty could be swayed, weaknesses in the company's structure, legal avenues waiting in the shadows. Every observation recorded, every strategy refined. And late at night, staring at the city through my window, I allowed myself a thought, not gloating, not triumph yet, just clarity. They think they have won. They think I am gone. But the game is mine, and the storm is only beginning. Days bled into nights, each indistinguishable from the other, as the city hummed with life beneath me. Streetlights flickered, cars honked, pedestrians hustled past, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking shape from a modest apartment miles away. I, Isabella Hart, had become a ghost in the machine, unseen, underestimated, yet utterly indispensable in ways no one suspected. The anonymous proposal I had submitted days ago had landed like a pebble in a pond. Its ripples spread quietly but forcefully. Board members whispered in corridors. Teams whispered in break rooms. Productivity surged. A project that had been stagnant for months was suddenly on track, running more efficiently than ever. And Mr. Whitmore? He was unraveling. I observed him through the subtle surveillance I had arranged under the guise of consulting oversight. He paced in his office, voice raised in frustration at minor errors, gestures sharp and jerky. He questioned colleagues incessantly, second-guessed his own reports, even revisited old decisions as if their outcomes were unreliable. Every micro-expression, every nervous glance, every abrupt pause was a crack in the armor of his confidence, and I catalogued them all meticulously. The thrill of control surged through me. I had been invisible for so long, silenced, humiliated, dismissed, yet here I was, shaping events in ways he could not perceive. And the beauty of it was subtlety. Subtlety was power. Every small adjustment, every anonymous recommendation, every invisible correction was a thread pulling at the fabric of his authority. I began to escalate, still under the cloak of anonymity. Another proposal, this one addressing systemic inefficiencies, landed on the board's desks. It was precise, elegant, undeniable. It solved problems he didn't even realize existed. And when Whitmore attempted to claim credit, subtle corrections by board members, citing the unknown author, eroded his credibility further. I watched the tension rise across the table, his frustration invisible to all but the observant. Every move was calculated, every result documented, every weakness in him and the company catalogued for future leverage. I walked the streets at night, letting the autumn chill wash over me, and mapped my next steps in my mind. Who could be swayed? Which allies could be quietly recruited? Which weaknesses could be exploited without suspicion? Whitmore's paranoia began to manifest in increasingly visible ways. Meetings that had once been concise turned into marathons of over-explaining. Emails were repeated, clarified, obsessively revised. Colleagues whispered, exchanged glances, and hesitated before agreeing with him. And I smiled, quietly, savoring the rhythm of his unraveling. Every success, no matter how small, was a lesson in patience and precision. I was no longer reacting, I was orchestrating. And the beauty was that he had no idea.
Not yet.
The ghost manipulating his every move, invisible threads of influence, was Isabella Hart, the very employee he had fired, dismissed, mocked. Late one night, I returned to the envelope from my grandfather, tracing the faded ink with my finger. Claim it when the time is right. Trust yourself. I had never understood the weight of those words until now. They were more than guidance. They were prophecy. And I trusted myself completely. Every observation, every subtle manipulation, every invisible correction was preparation. Not for revenge, not for petty satisfaction, but for the moment when precision, control, and timing would converge. I allowed myself a rare indulgence, a slow, deliberate smile. Not of triumph, not yet, but of understanding. The tide was rising. Whitmore was floundering. The board was intrigued. The company, unwittingly, was bending to my design. And as I walked the quiet streets that night, the city lights glinting like distant stars, I realized something. This was no longer about reclaiming what had been denied to me. It was about shaping the future. Mine, theirs, the company's on my terms. The The storm was no longer coming. It had already begun. And when it finally struck, there would be no escape. The morning sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows of the boardroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished table. The room smelled faintly of coffee, expensive paper, and attention that could be cut with a knife. Everyone filed in, their footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. The board members settled into their seats, and the assistants shuffled reports and tablets across the table. Whitmore arrived last, as always, perfectly coiffed, impeccably dressed, a portrait of corporate confidence. He smiled broadly, but I could almost see the tremor beneath it, the tiniest hint of uncertainty that would soon widen into a chasm. I watched from the reflection of the glass in the hallway outside, invisible to everyone, but fully present in every detail. His gait was measured, almost exaggerated, as if he were trying to convince himself that he had control. And for a moment, he almost did, until the board members began reviewing the documents I had quietly placed in circulation, the anonymous proposals I had engineered with precision. Whitmore started with a rehearsed spiel, smooth and rehearsed. As you all know, the recent improvements in departmental efficiencies are the result of strategic leadership and careful planning. I've ensured that our teams operate at peak performance. His voice was steady, polished. But the room shifted, subtle glances exchanged between board members. Their eyes flicked toward the proposal documents, toward notes highlighting areas he hadn't addressed. I saw it, the micro-moment where his confidence faltered. A flicker of hesitation, almost imperceptible, as he searched for authority in the blank space between his words and the document's content. I had set this up carefully, every step calculated. The timing, the phrasing, the formatting of the proposal. Every element worked to highlight a gap he couldn't explain. Whitmore, one board member said softly but firmly, adjusting her glasses, some of these improvements correspond directly to recommendations in the recent proposal submitted last week. Her eyes didn't look at him. They didn't need to. Her words landed like a scalpel. Whitmore blinked. A pause. Then another. He opened his mouth, searching for a retort, but the words stuck somewhere between pride and panic. I watched him shift, straighten, clear his throat, attempting a joke that fell flat. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. I noted every twitch, every micro-expression, every subtle lapse of composure. I took a slow breath, my hand tracing the rim of my coffee mug. Every subtle disruption was intentional. Each hesitation he exhibited was catalogued, a tiny victory in a symphony I had composed over weeks of careful observation and preparation. He tried to reassert control, launching into a detailed account of his management decisions. But every point he raised had already been addressed in the proposal, elegantly, invisibly, undeniably. Colleagues who had once been loyal to him nodded politely, their attentions subtly divided between the documents and the micro-adjustments I had introduced. I could feel his frustration growing, a slow burn that he attempted to mask with polished words. His hands tapped nervously against the polished table, a rhythm betraying the panic he refused to acknowledge. I could almost hear the silent screams of pride battling the creeping fear that he was no longer in control. The meeting stretched on, each minute amplifying the tension. Board members asked pointed questions, each answered flawlessly by the structured proposal I had sent anonymously. Whitmore stumbled more than once, pausing mid-sentence, recalculating responses, adjusting slides, shuffling papers. The room's energy shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. His authority, carefully constructed over years, wavered like a candle in the wind. I allowed myself a quiet smile. Patience had been my ally for months. The invisible hand manipulating events, quietly guiding decisions and subtly undermining confidence, had now fully shifted the balance of power. After hours of carefully orchestrated dialogue, the meeting finally adjourned. Whitmore left the room, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight, eyes darting nervously as if searching for an explanation he could not articulate. Board members exchanged soft, conspiratorial glances, some intrigued, some confused, all subtly aware that someone, somewhere, had orchestrated the tide turning beneath their feet. I stepped out into the city streets that evening, the chill of autumn pressing against my cheeks, my mind racing with the day's observations. Every twitch, every pause, every subtle hesitation had been noted, every weak point catalogued, every ally, every opportunity, every potential lever identified. This was no longer just strategy. This was orchestration. The storm I had begun shaping was now undeniable. And yet, the climax was still ahead. Whitmore, desperate to maintain control, did not realize that he had already been outmaneuvered. His panic was growing, subtle but visible to me. He sensed a change, a shift he couldn't name, a force moving within his company that was beyond his control. The storm had arrived. The tide had risen. And I, Isabella Hart, would guide it to its inevitable conclusion. I returned to my apartment that night, reviewing every detail of the day, every micro-expression, every falter. The boardroom had been the first stage, and the reaction had been perfect. The chessboard was set, every piece in place. And the queen, long underestimated, was now quietly moving into position. And the beauty of it all? Whitmore had no idea. Not yet. The reckoning was coming. The morning light slanted through the tall glass windows of the office, painting sharp lines across the polished marble floor. The building hummed with a quiet energy, the kind of energy that comes just before a storm breaks. Everyone moved through their routines, heads down, eyes on screens, the hum of keyboards and murmured conversations a deceptive lull. I could feel it in the air, a tension that had been building for days, invisible to everyone but me. Whitmore arrived early, more so than usual. The confident strut he had always perfected was replaced by a measured, almost anxious gait. His suit was impeccable, of course, but the aura he carried had shifted. Subtle twitching of his fingers, a slight tightening of his jaw, the way he avoided eye contact with certain colleagues, all tiny indicators I had catalogued over weeks, now becoming increasingly pronounced. From my vantage point, I observed him closely through discreet cameras I had strategically placed under the guise of security consulting. Every micro-expression, every subtle hesitation, was a piece of the puzzle I was assembling. The city outside moved as if nothing had changed, but inside, in that building, a storm had begun, one I controlled. I had orchestrated today carefully. The internal report had been misfiled, just enough to delay his access. Emails I knew he would need were subtly rerouted, flagged, or slightly altered to create friction. A minor, almost invisible error had been introduced into a department projection he relied on. Not enough to be catastrophic, but enough to make him hesitate, to force him to question his decisions. He began calling meetings almost immediately, his voice clipped, his usual smooth cadence fraying at the edges. He demanded updates, questioned staff, re-examined decisions made days ago. His panic was subtle at first, but I could see it growing. The shadow of doubt had taken root, and it was spreading like wildfire. By mid-morning, the first real confrontation began. A senior manager, emboldened by the flawless execution of my subtle interventions, challenged one of Whitmore's decisions during a team meeting. "Sir, the numbers from the East Coast Division don't align with projections. Perhaps we should consider the recommendations from the proposals circulated last week." The words were careful, measured, polite, but they landed like a hammer. Whitmore froze, blinked, shuffled papers nervously, and attempted to respond. But the answer was already embedded in the systems I had influenced. Every correction, every alignment had been implemented invisibly. His authority, so carefully cultivated over years, faltered. He tried to assert control, but the room had shifted subtly. Board members exchanged brief glances, colleagues hesitated before responding, and I could almost hear the panic rising in his mind. The meeting dragged on for hours. Each question he posed, each objection he raised, was anticipated and subtly countered. I had prepared every scenario, every potential misstep, and every invisible correction in advance. He was floundering, pacing, tapping pens against the table, adjusting slides repeatedly. Colleagues whispered, watched, and the tension thickened. His confidence crumbled with each passing minute, though he refused to acknowledge it aloud. By late afternoon, his paranoia was palpable. He called another meeting, this time with a few board members, attempting to regain some semblance of control. But the invisible architecture I had built had already reshaped the flow of the company. Projects aligned, deadlines met, departments functioning with unseen guidance, and he could see none of it. His frustration radiated through every gesture, the repeated clearing of his throat, the rigid posture, the tapping fingers. From my quiet observation point, I felt a thrill of power, but tempered by patience. Every falter, every hesitation, every nervous glance was a victory, not of malice, but of precision. The game had changed. He was no longer commanding, he was reacting. He was no longer leading, he was trying to survive. As the evening approached, Whitmore's desperation reached a crescendo. He lingered in his office, muttering to himself, reviewing reports multiple times, making phone calls, attempting to regain control over a situation that had already slipped from his grasp. He glanced repeatedly at the proposal documents, the same documents I had anonymously submitted, and his eyes betrayed the first real hint of fear. I stepped out onto my balcony that night, the city lights stretching endlessly before me. The streets glowed faintly, unaware of the quiet storm that had overtaken the building miles away. I reflected on the weeks of planning, the meticulous observations, the invisible manipulations, and I allowed myself a rare smile. The storm I had been cultivating for months had arrived. Whitmore could feel it, sense it, even fear it, but he had no idea where it came from or who controlled it. And the best part? He had no idea it was me. Isabella Hart, the employee he had fired, the one he had underestimated, was now the unseen force reshaping his world. I returned inside, reviewing every detail of the day in my journal. Every hesitation, every micro-expression, every subtle disruption noted meticulously. The chessboard was set, every piece in position. And the queen, long underestimated, dismissed, and dismissed again, was finally moving into the open, unseen but unstoppable. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself a thought both exhilarating and terrifying. Soon, everything he believes will crumble. Soon, the truth of Isabella Hart will be undeniable. And when it does, there will be no turning back. The morning arrived with all the precision of a well-timed curtain rising on a theater stage. Sunlight slashed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the office tower, bouncing off polished marble, chrome, and the carefully curated smiles of executives. The aroma of bitter coffee, designer perfume, and the faintly disinfected tang of corporate ambition filled the air. Every sound, the click of heels, the rustle of papers, the hum of computers, was amplified by the tension that thrummed quietly beneath it. And there, at the center of this fragile universe, stood Mr. Whitmore, strutting like a self-proclaimed emperor. His tie was perfectly knotted, his cuffs gleaming, and his expression smug, the kind of smugness that comes from years of thinking brilliance equals control. But today, that smugness would be put to a test. I observed him from my hidden vantage point, my coffee lukewarm but forgotten. Every detail mattered. The way he scanned the room, the almost imperceptible twitch in his left hand, the tiny furrow of his brow when someone raised a question he hadn't anticipated. Weeks of careful planning had brought me to this point. Every department email, every subtly altered report, every delayed notification, all converged today to reveal the truth behind the seamless improvements the company had experienced. Whitmore began his theatrics, raising his hands in mock authority. Ladies and gentlemen, today I will outline the recent improvements in our divisions. His voice was polished, rehearsed. And that's the truth behind every overlooked intern, every assistant who stays late, every voice that's been ignored because it wasn't loud enough to be heard in a boardroom. Power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears uncertainty and keeps going anyway. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told to wait your turn, this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to Everyday Dramas for more stories like this, the kind that turn everyday moments into quiet revolutions. Drop a comment. Have you ever worked somewhere you felt invisible? Let's talk about it. The room was rife with quiet tension. Colleagues whispered, exchanged knowing glances, and subtly reinforced the evidence of his failure. The satire of it all, a man who had strutted through the office like a monarch now reduced to a flailing amateur, was delicious. And yet, I remained unseen. Invisible. Untouchable. Hours passed like this, Whitmore spiraling further. He called unnecessary meetings, sent frantic emails, double-checked reports, and attempted to reassert control over departments that no longer needed him. His every action was a performance of desperation, amplified by the silent, perfect execution of the changes I had instilled. Every micro-expression, every tremor, every pause, all catalogued, all noted, all part of the crescendo I had orchestrated. Even as the day wound down, he had not recovered. He lingered in his office, muttering to himself, calling subordinates, rereading reports, attempting to trace the invisible hand guiding the company. Every attempt failed. Every effort only highlighted his inadequacy. I walked the quiet streets that evening, the city lights shimmering below like a reflection of the chaos I had created. The storm I had been cultivating for months was no longer subtle. Whitmore could feel it, sense it, even fear it, but he could not identify its source. And that, my dear reader, was the most exquisite part. I sipped my coffee and allowed myself a thought that had been building in intensity for weeks. They think this is a crisis. They think the company is rebelling. They do not realize it is not rebellion, it is reckoning. And when the truth of Isabella Hart is finally revealed, there will be no saving him. By nightfall, Whitmore had become a man haunted. His reflection in the boardroom window showed every fear, every doubt, every miscalculation played back in the harsh light of undeniable truth. He was learning, far too late, that brilliance alone does not command loyalty, respect, or results. And I, Isabella Hart, long underestimated, long dismissed, had become the invisible architect of his undoing. The tide had risen. The unmasking had begun. And soon, very soon, the world would see me, and Whitmore would finally understand exactly who he had fired. The morning air was crisp, sharp enough to cut through the pretense that had filled the office for years. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bouncing off marble floors, chrome fixtures, and the polished shoes of executives who believed they were untouchable. The smell of bitter coffee mingled with the faint tang of expensive perfume, a sensory orchestra for the absurd theater of corporate life. Whitmore sat at the head of the boardroom table, papers meticulously arranged, tie perfectly aligned, a man who had spent decades perfecting the illusion of control. But today, that illusion would crumble. He didn't know it yet, but he could feel the shift in the air. Something was different. Something unseen had infiltrated every corner of his empire. And soon he would see it. I entered the building with measured grace, letting each step echo faintly against the marble floors. I didn't rush. The click of my heels was a metronome, marking the countdown to his undoing. Each glance from a colleague, each subtle shift in posture as I passed, was noted, catalogued, and absorbed. The tension in the office was palpable, though no one yet knew the source. Whitmore's eyes flicked up as I approached, recognition dawning, panic almost imperceptible but real. His mouth opened to speak, then closed. He sensed something, though he couldn't articulate it. The man had always believed in controlling every detail, but today, control was an illusion he could not grasp. The boardroom was set for a strategic vision session, though the real purpose was far more precise, the unveiling of truth. Chairs gleamed, documents were neatly stacked, and the hum of anticipation was almost tangible. Whitmore entered first, shoulders stiff, attempting authority but radiating anxiety. Every move, from the tap of his pen to the shuffle of his papers, betrayed his internal collapse. I entered moments later. Silence fell, not loud, but heavy, like a storm pressing on fragile glass. I walked slowly, deliberately, heels echoing against the floor, letting the weight of my presence settle over the room. Every eye followed, curiosity laced with tension. Whitmore's face registered the first hint of real fear, a flicker of awareness that the world he had built on ego and control was about to be upended. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I have something important to share, a clarification regarding recent events and the leadership of this company." Whitmore swallowed, his throat tight, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. His panic was subtle but unmistakable, a man beginning to realize he was no longer in command. "I am Isabella Hart," I declared, letting the name settle like a stone in a still pond. "I am the rightful owner of this company's parent organization. Every improvement, every initiative, every seamless execution over the past months, all guided by my hand. Not as a consultant, not as an employee, but as the one with ultimate authority and vision." The room froze. Board members blinked in disbelief. Whispers rippled quietly, a symphony of incredulity. Whitmore's face drained of color, his perfect composure fracturing as his mind raced to comprehend what he was hearing. That's impossible," he stammered, voice cracking under the weight of shock. You can't." "Yes," I interrupted, steady and unyielding. "I am the granddaughter of the company's founder, the heir whose existence was deliberately hidden until it was needed most. And you, Mr. Whitmore, have been an actor in a drama far larger than you ever imagined, a drama of vision, strategy, and rightful authority. And until now, you did not even know the script." Whitmore's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. He gestured vaguely, floundering for words, for authority, for credibility, any tool to salvage the crumbling image of himself. But every gesture, every appeal, every flailing attempt was rendered futile. The evidence of my unseen guidance, the flawless execution of departments, the undeniable improvements, all pointed to a single truth. He was powerless, exposed, and humiliated. I let a slow, deliberate smile cross my face. The satire of it all, the man who had believed himself indispensable, now trembling in a room full of witnesses, was delicious. "You see," I continued, voice resonant, eyes sweeping the boardroom, "your arrogance, your dismissiveness, your vanity, they have blinded you. You have claimed credit for work you did not understand, dismissed those you underestimated, and mocked the very foundation upon which this company was built. And now," I paused, letting the suspense thicken like fog, "you will understand the cost of underestimating Isabella Hart." Whitmore's jaw tightened. He looked to the board, desperately seeking allies, but found only polite shock and measured curiosity. His empire of intimidation had evaporated. Every whispered command, every coercive glance, every inflated gesture of power, meaningless in the face of truth. I stepped closer, each motion deliberate, each click of my heels a drumbeat of inevitability. "I am not here for petty revenge," I said softly, deliberately. "I am here to restore the vision and authority this company deserves. And if anyone doubts that, the results over the past months speak louder than any title, any position, or any empty boast." The board murmured, absorbing the weight of my words. Their expressions shifted from surprise to dawning comprehension. The invisible force guiding the company had finally materialized. They understood subtle manipulations, flawless implementations, unseen corrections. All were my doing. Whitmore's face twisted in fury, disbelief, and humiliation. He attempted to speak again, but I interrupted with quiet authority. "Your tenure is over. Your position is no longer tenable. The company belongs to those who lead with vision, not with fear. To those who understand stewardship, not ego." The silence that followed was absolute, almost painful. I had stepped from the shadows. I was no longer invisible. And in that moment, the weight of authority was undeniable. Whitmore slumped, defeated, the mask of control shattered. I allowed a slow, deliberate smile. The reveal was complete. The unmasking had begun. The board, once loyal to him, now saw the truth. Isabella Hart had arrived, not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as the rightful leader, the architect of every success, and the force behind the storm that had undone Whitmore. And in that moment, as I surveyed the room, I felt the quiet, intoxicating surge of victory, not only over him, but over the narrative of my life. The storm had arrived. The tides had shifted. And now I was in control. The morning air carried an almost sacred stillness, as though the world itself knew something monumental was about to unfold. Sunlight streamed through the skyscraper's glass walls, glinting off marble floors, chrome door handles, and polished conference room chairs, scattering light in a pattern that looked like the precise plotting of fate. Shadows stretched long across the room, distorting reality, exaggerating the tension. The faint scent of espresso lingered, mingling with subtle perfume and the sterile tang of ambition, a smell that masked nerves, fear, and egos. Whitmore sat at the head of the boardroom table like a man who believed himself invincible. His tie was perfectly knotted. His cufflinks gleamed as though forged from hubris itself. Every gesture, every posture screamed authority. And yet, beneath the practiced confidence, the cracks had begun to show. His hands twitched, his breath came in shallow bursts, and the faintest flicker of dread passed over his face. I paused in the doorway, observing him. Every detail mattered. The subtle tremor in his fingers as he tapped the polished wood, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the slight darting of his eyes as he scanned the room for reassurance. Every movement was a revelation. Whitmore believed he controlled the narrative, but today, he would discover he had been an unwitting actor in a drama written long before he arrived. I walked slowly into the room, each step deliberate, heels clicking against marble like a measured drumbeat marking the countdown to his unraveling. Every eye turned toward me. A murmur of curiosity passed through the board and staff, restrained but palpable. The tension was thick, almost tactile. Whitmore's eyes widened, and I saw the first real spark of panic. Subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "I have called this meeting to clarify certain developments, to address what has truly been happening within this company, and to make certain things unmistakably clear." Whitmore's hand shook slightly as he reached for a pen. Clarifications?" he stammered, voice tight, brittle, as if the words themselves might shatter under the pressure of what was coming. "Yes," I replied, my gaze sweeping across the room, lingering on board members, staff, and finally, him. Clarifications about leadership, responsibility, and the future of this company. I let a silence fall. The kind of silence that stretches, that makes every breath feel loud, that heightens the senses. Whitmore's lips parted, then closed. He tried to summon composure, but the effort was futile. Every twitch of his fingers, every micro-expression of fear betrayed the knowledge deep inside him. He was no longer in control. "I am Isabella Hart," I said, letting the words linger in the air like a physical presence. "I am the rightful owner of the parent company. Every improvement, every initiative, every seamless execution over the past months has been guided under my direction. Not as an employee, not as a consultant, but as the one with ultimate authority." The room froze. Board members blinked rapidly, whispered softly to one another, exchanged glances filled with disbelief. Whitmore's face drained of color. Shock, fear, humiliation, all played across his features in a grotesque, silent symphony. He tried to speak, but found no words capable of bridging the gap between his perception and reality. That's impossible," he said, voice cracking like dry wood snapping under weight. You can't, you're just..." "Yes," I interrupted, calm, unyielding. "I am the granddaughter of the founder. I have been the invisible hand behind every improvement, every project, every operational success. And you, Whitmore, have been an unwitting participant in a story far larger than you realized. A story you thought you controlled, but which has been unfolding independently of you and flawlessly." I paused to let the full weight of my words sink in. The satire of it all, the man who had strutted through the office as if he owned it, the self-proclaimed genius, now powerless and exposed, was almost too delicious to bear. His empire, built on intimidation and ego, was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. You see, I continued, pacing slowly in front of the board, letting every gesture emphasize the inevitability of his downfall. True leadership is not built on ego, fear, or theatrics. Leadership is vision. It is accountability. It is understanding the people and systems you guide. You wielded authority like a weapon, but without comprehension, without responsibility. And now you will experience the cost of that mistake. Whitmore tried to interject, voice rising, gesturing wildly, but every action only reinforced his impotence. The board watched silently, riveted, as the once mighty figure of authority became a caricature of panic, desperation, and absurdity. His control had dissolved entirely, leaving a man confronted by the full weight of reality. I stepped closer, each movement deliberate, every step punctuated by the click of my heels against marble. "Your tenure ends today," I said softly, with precision and finality. "Not because you failed, though, truthfully, you have failed spectacularly, but because the company demands stewardship, vision, and accountability. Not theater. Not fear. Not ego. The company deserves leadership that understands responsibility and acts with integrity." His face contorted in disbelief, rage, humiliation, and desperation, a grotesque blend that made his collapse both tragic and absurd. He searched the room for allies, for any sign of loyalty, but found none. Every glance, every subtle nod, every quiet whisper of acknowledgement reinforced the truth. He was defeated. I allowed a faint, deliberate smile. The storm I had cultivated, the tension I had allowed to build, the invisible manipulations now fully visible, all converged at this moment. The revelation was complete. Whitmore, the self-proclaimed emperor, was powerless before the undeniable authority of Isabella Hart. Turning to the board, I let my voice soften, carrying reassurance and command in equal measure. This company will move forward under rightful leadership. It will flourish because it is guided by vision, strategy, and accountability, not by fear or spectacle. A quiet murmur ran through the room. Faces shifted from shock to comprehension. The invisible architect of progress had been unmasked, and the employees, the board, and even the humbled executives finally understood who had been orchestrating the improvements that had seemed almost magical. Whitmore slumped into his chair. The final trace of arrogance, the last shred of self-importance, had crumbled. His empire, a fragile construct of ego, theatrics, and intimidation, was no more. He was a cautionary tale, a man undone by his own hubris, left to confront the full consequences of underestimating those he believed inferior. I walked to the window, gazing out at the city stretching below, a glittering mosaic of motion and life. Lights shimmered in the early evening, oblivious to the seismic shift in one office high above. I reflected on the journey. The dismissal, the underestimation, the careful orchestration, the patient accumulation of power. And finally, the culmination. Every subtle intervention, every unnoticed correction, every carefully executed plan had led to this moment. One thought rose in me, quiet, fierce, and undeniable. The storm is over. The crown is mine. The company will thrive. And no one, not arrogance, not fear, not deceit, will ever underestimate Isabella Hart again. The quiet crown had been claimed. Whitmore would fade into history, a lesson in arrogance and overconfidence. The company would move forward, stronger, sharper, and guided by true vision. And I would lead, steady, unshakable, and fully, undeniably in control. The city lights reflected in the window like 1,000 tiny crowns. The quiet crown had been claimed, and its weight was mine. The weight of justice, authority, and inevitable triumph. We've reached the end of this story, but the journey isn't over. From betrayal to triumph, I've shown that no one can define your worth but you. Now, I want to hear your story. When have you turned a setback into your greatest strength? Comment below. Your experiences might inspire someone else to rise. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is the kind of story that proves the underestimated can always rise, and the impossible can become reality. Stay with me, the next story might just change everything again.